Welcome back. I'm Phil Spencer, TalkSport writer and Middlesbrough fan, and this is a whistle-stop tour through the biggest talking points of Kieran Scott's interview with BBC Tees this week. Middlesbrough's head of football has been doing the rounds in the media following the end of the summer transfer window a couple of weeks ago. Scott sat down with Mark Drury on BBC Tees on Monday night, which was a brilliant listen for anyone who hasn't tuned in already. Drury and BBC Tees are excellent when it comes to doing these long-form interviews, and they certainly don't shy away from asking the big questions that supporters want to hear more about. I strongly recommend listening to the full interview, and I'll put the link to the full interview in the comments below. But if you don't have time for that, here are the biggest talking points from that interview with Kieran Scott. It's well worth a listen. One of the key themes from all of Kieran Scott's interviews over the last week or so has been the fact that he's been keen to stress that the club's recruitment model is not data-led. Now, he's obviously spoken to a number of outlets in the last week. He spoke to BBC Tees, which we're discussing here. He spoke to the Boro Breakdown podcast. He also did one with the Middlesbrough's official media channels as well. And it was very much a process of almost trying to educate supporters as to what it is exactly that he does, what his team do at Rockcliffe Park, and the way that they go about doing their business. Now, a lot of clubs in this day and age rely heavily on data. It is a growing part of the game. It's something that people use to analyse the game within an inch of its life. But Kieran Scott was very, very keen to stress that although it plays a part in Middlesbrough's recruitment model, it is not a leading part of it. Kieran Scott was saying that basically relying on data can lead to missing out on players. I think if you are too stringent on the other figures and that you're focusing on, there is a possibility that you are missing out on players who have the sheer talent that you're viewing with the bare eye. Kieran Scott did say that as part of their recruitment model, they look at data. It is a big part of what they do. It does guide what they do in terms of bringing in players to the club. But Kieran Scott is a little bit old school by his own admission. He says that his main priority is always getting out there to watch players in the flesh, making sure that he can go out there, see them with his own eye, see whether they would fit into Michael Carrick's style of play. And by doing that, it means that he does get the context of how that player would fit into the club, because data is all well and good, but it doesn't really account for the fact that playing in different leagues, playing against different teams, it does change things. Obviously, if you're playing in the Premier League, it's going to be tougher than it's going to be playing in League Two. So you can't really compare the data from the two sets. Likewise, if you're playing in one of Europe's top 5 leagues like La Liga, Serie A, the Bundesliga, it's going to be much, much harder to put in a solid performance based on data than it would be playing in, one of the lesser European leagues. So it's something that there does need to be an element of context about. I think from Kieran Scott's point of view, he was stressing that clubs and the media more so do seem to be stressing that that clubs are very much relying solely on data. They're only buying players based on what's coming up on their spreadsheet. But Kieran Scott was very keen to stress that is absolutely not the case with Middlesbrough. And while it does play a part in their recruitment model, the players that did sign for Middlesbrough over the course of this summer were signed based more so on the scouting efforts of the team, going out there, meeting the players, watching them in the flesh. And that was ultimately what convinced Middlesbrough to sign them in the first place. Kieran Scott's next revelation took me a little bit by surprise when he announced that Middlesbrough fans should be subscribing to Phil Spencer's YouTube channel. It seems a little bit out of context given that he was talking about the summer transfer window, but given his recent track record at the Riverside, it would be foolish not to take his recommendation on board. So what are you waiting for? Okay, Kieran Scott didn't actually mention my YouTube channel, but what he did talk about was Middlesbrough's successful attempt to sign Tommy Conway from Bristol City. Now, Kieran Scott was speaking about the move on BBC Tees, and he was saying that, in fact, Middlesbrough had been interested in him long before the summer actually got underway. Middlesbrough were very aware of Tommy Conway's contract situation. He was moving into the final year. It was a deal at Ashton Gate, which meant that Bristol City were in a bit of a tricky position. Conway had made it clear that he didn't want to stay at Ashton Gate, and that meant that Bristol City were in a position where they would have to sell this summer if they were going to get anything near his real market value. For Middlesbrough, it was just really a case of being patient. They had to wait for Bristol City and Conway to kind of conclude their talks over signing a new contract, something which obviously didn't come to fruition. And they then had to deal with Bristol City, obviously trying to get top dollar for their player. But given that he was into that final year of the contract, they were in a position where they couldn't really win. Now, Kieran Scott was quite open about the other deal to bring in Tommy Conway, and he basically admitted that Middlesbrough wouldn't have been able to sign him had he not been in the last year of his contract. Tommy Conway is and was one of the top young talents in the Championship. particularly over the last couple of seasons where he's got into double digits in both campaigns. And that would have meant that had he had 3-4 years on his contract at Bristol City, they probably would have been commanding anything from 15 to 20 million potentially. But because of his situation, because Bristol City were at risk of losing him for absolutely nothing, Middlesbrough were able to remain patient and strike a deal which proved to be a very good business. He's looked absolutely fantastic at Middlesbrough since he's come in. He's already scored a couple of goals, looking like a real surefire regular starter for Michael Carrick's team. It looks like he's always been part of that system. Although he's a centre forward, he's also been playing at number 10 as well. He just looks like a real good signing for Middlesbrough, and one which, ultimately has proved to certainly pay off for Middlesbrough. It's been a good deal in terms of finances. It's been a good deal in terms of signing a talented young player. And given that Scott's admission that Conway probably had more lucrative offers elsewhere, it seems that Conway was very keen to move to the Riverside and be part of Michael Carrick's project, which is brilliant to hear. The next big talking point from Kieran Scott's interview was that of Emmanuel Latte Lath. Now, it had been quite a quiet summer as far as he'd been concerned. There had been tentative interest early in the summer. His agent had been out on social media kind of saying that his client was very happy to stay at Middlesbrough for the upcoming season, and it all seemed all well and rosy. But going into transfer deadline day, everything sort of changed when Ipswich Town came in with a bid of £20 million. Now, in truth, it seemed like Ipswich were never really that interested in Latte Lath. I think they'd been prioritising a deal for Armando Broja at Chelsea, and they had been looking to sign a striker, but Emmanuel Latte Lath was sort of a second or third choice option on deadline day. But what it did spark a little bit of chaos at Middlesbrough on that day. The club were due to travel down to Cardiff for the Championship fixture on the Saturday. The team left to head down there. Emmanuel Latte Lath did not go. He wanted to stick around and talk about his future, so he stuck around at Rockcliffe Park to discuss his plans with Kieran Scott. And ultimately, it was decided that he was going to be staying at Middlesbrough, and he ultimately, voluntarily, it is being stressed that he decided to drive down to Cardiff independently to join up with his teammates and show his commitment to Middlesbrough moving forward. Now, obviously, the cynics among us will be thinking this is a situation that could arise once again in January. There's no real knowing whether that's going to happen. We don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know whether Ipswich or another team are going to come back in for Latte Lath. But Kieran Scott's comments on him were very interesting indeed. He was basically saying that Middlesbrough and Steve Gibson in particular were absolutely adamant that they did not want to lose Latte Lath at any point this summer. Had Ipswich come in 2 weeks earlier, so in mid-August, theoretically there would have still been time for Middlesbrough to replace him. They still wouldn't have done so because in order to challenge for promotion, something that the club feel is a very real prospect this season, Steve Gibson and Kieran Scott decided that they would need to have their best striker as part of the team. Emmanuel Latte Lath is exactly that. The goals that he scored at the back end of last season were outstanding. It's been obviously a bit of a steady start for him so far this term, but he is the player who does have the potential to make the difference in the promotion battle. So, yeah, there was no real intention from Middlesbrough to sell Latte Lath at any point this summer. Kieran Scott also made the point that while obviously the money put up by Ipswich would have been potentially good, they would have had no time to sign a replacement. Even if they'd been able to go out and not spend the full transfer fee that they got for Latte Lath and managed to sign someone for 4 or 5 million, they wouldn't have been in a position where they would have done their required due diligence. It would have been a bit reactive, and so that would have meant that it would have been a risky transfer to make. Everything the Middlesbrough are trying to do at the moment is very strategic in terms of how they go about doing things. So it feels to me like Latte Lath was never likely to leave the club this summer, but potentially after the interest from Ipswich, there might be conversations going on in the background as to how they would go about it. Should another club come in for him in January? Should there be any targets that could come in to replace Latte Lath? That's just conjecture. That's just my opinion. That's not something that Kieran Scott said. But yeah, very clear from Kieran Scott that Middlesbrough were never going to be selling Latte Lath over the course of the summer. He's a big part of Middlesbrough's plans. He was very keen to stress that Latte Lath is committed to Middlesbrough for the upcoming season. Time will tell, I guess, on that. But as far as Scott was concerned, it was never a deal that was likely to be done. And so that drama on deadline day was very much about nothing, really. Ben Doak was a big talking point for Kieran Scott during his interview on BBC Tees. The winger joined Middlesbrough on a season-long loan deal on transfer deadline day, a move that got fans very excited because of the sheer talent of the player. Now, Doak was the topic of a couple of different questions during the course of that interview, one of which was about the way that Middlesbrough go about signing players more generally. Is it a case that Michael Carrick is suggesting players to Kieran Scott for the club to sign and do their due diligence on, or is it more the case that Kieran Scott and his scouting team are finding players, identifying them, and then pitching them to Michael Carrick to be part of his team? The truth is that it kind of works both ways. There's a bit of an open relationship there. Both men are able to I guess, express in dialogue the players that they want to bring in. And if they do get approval from the other party, then they're able to do so. Now, Doak is a player who was recommended very much by Michael Carrick. Michael Carrick had said to Kieran Scott earlier on in the summer that Doak was a player that he'd love to sign should the opportunity arise. Obviously, with Arne Slot coming in at Liverpool, it was never really known how Doak would fit into Liverpool's plans, whether he was someone who was going to get an opportunity. Obviously, with loan deals like this from the Premier League, usually there's a little bit of time that it takes for a deal to happen, because these young players often go away with their parent clubs in pre-season, so that the head coach can have a little look at them, and then the decision seems to be made more in mid to late August, and that's what happened with Doak. So it was a very interesting one. Michael Carrick took Doak and his profile, I guess, to Kieran Scott to take a look at. Jonathan Woodgate, who worked for Liverpool a few years back, he worked as a scout and a youth coach with Liverpool. He's someone who knows Doak well, so he was someone who was able to really kind of praise the winger and say that he would be a good quality addition for Middlesbrough should the opportunity arise to sign him. And that meant that Michael Carrick ultimately was able to get the deal over the line. Kieran Scott was able to go out there and do his due diligence on Ben Doak and go on Michael Carrick's recommendation to sign the player. Now, Middlesbrough have made it quite clear that as part of their current recruitment model, if they are going to be signing players on loan, they would be liking to sign players who would come in on loan with the prospect of signing them on a permanent basis. But I think Kieran Scott was very, very keen to make it clear that that isn't really the case with Doak. Doak is a player who has a really, really high ceiling, someone who Scott says is very, very highly thought of by Liverpool and by Arne Slot and by the coaches there. So he's not someone that Liverpool would be wanting to lose on a permanent basis. So that means that Ben Doak's move to Middlesbrough is very much a straight loan deal, a season-long loan deal, and then he will return to Anfield next summer. It's not the case that there's any sort of buy option in his loan deal. It's not a deal that Middlesbrough are expecting to be able to pursue on a permanent basis next summer. He's such a talented young player. He's now a Scotland international as well. He's a very talented player who Liverpool see as a big part of their future. And so for Middlesbrough, there's no real prospect of signing him on a permanent basis, but hopefully they can play a big role in his development this season and give him some regular first-team football. And from their own point of view, get to use a very, very talented young player to help them secure promotion. If he can do that and if he can show his potential at the Riverside, I think everyone will be very, very happy with the deal. But yeah, it was certainly a very interesting conversation about Doak because there's been a lot of discussion about him, a lot of excitement from Middlesbrough supporters. But unfortunately on this one, it's not a deal that is likely to be turning permanent next summer. Yeah, he's likely to be heading back to Anfield and hopefully after securing promotion for Middlesbrough in the Championship. Who knows? The next talking point was certainly one which caught me off guard, and that was to do with a strategic partnership with Juninho in South America. Now, Juninho had been on Teesside earlier on in the summer. He was the guest of honour at a Q&A hosted by the Red back in early August. He was also invited to the Riverside Stadium for Middlesbrough's final pre-season friendly against Heerenveen, where he got to meet the supporters in attendance, kind of reinstate his legendary status and prove that he is ultimately the Middlesbrough GOAT. But from Kieran Scott's point of view, it wasn't all niceties. It was very much a case of he got to have the chance to sit down with Juninho and have a conversation about a potential strategic partnership moving forward. Now, Juninho is based in South America at the moment, and there is talk, according to Scott, of him being involved in the takeover of a big Brazilian club. I've done a little bit of research on this, and I couldn't exactly find what the deal was there, but it's one to keep an eye on, I guess, from Middlesbrough's point of view, because as far as Kieran Scott's concerned, he's very, very keen to use that link with Juninho to tap into the South American market. Now, we all know that South America is an absolute hotbed of footballing talent from Brazil. And obviously, there's a huge number of talented young players come through Brazil. It's arguably the biggest country in the world when it comes to developing talented young players, and that's why Brazil have dominated the international game for so long, albeit not so much in the last couple of years. You've also got the likes of Argentina and Uruguay, countries in South America who also dominate world football, who also develop talented young players, and that's something that Kieran Scott's keen to tap into. Obviously, Scott is very keen to try and sign the best untapped young players in world football. And that's something that Middlesbrough should be aspiring to do if they are to aspire to get out of the Championship and into the Premier League. And I think it seems that he's keen to use that relationship with Juninho to try and attract some talented young Brazilian players over to Middlesbrough. It's a situation where there's not really a huge amount to talk about yet, other than what we've just said. But it's certainly one to watch, because if Middlesbrough can utilise that relationship with Juninho, it's something that I think Middlesbrough could be very, very happy with. It's a setup that could really work in their favour. As far as South American young players are concerned, they would very, very much take the recommendation of Juninho on board. So if Juninho was saying that Middlesbrough would be a good club to go and join, whether it be on a loan deal, a development loan deal, whether it be joining to come to Middlesbrough and showcase their talents in a good league in the Championship, it's something which could certainly play into the hands of the players as well. But for Middlesbrough, it is an opportunity to have a foot in the door of the South American football market, a market which is renowned for developing these high-end, top-tier players, and something that Middlesbrough could really, really benefit from in the years to come, should they be able to bring in some players from that market. All in all, it was a really, really interesting interview from Kieran Scott. His sit down with BBC Tees was a brilliant listen, very, very insightful. But also his interviews with Boro Breakdown and the other media outlets as well was very, very interesting as well. From my point of view, I think it's really, really encouraging that Middlesbrough are now taking this proactive step for Kieran Scott to come out and speak to the media after the summer transfer window. In years gone by, there's always been a bit of a case of a bit of a disconnect, really, between the club's decision makers and supporters. Fans have never really known what the thinking is behind certain transfer deals, the direction of the club, and how the club are looking to operate moving forward. But we have seen it over the last couple of transfer windows that Kieran Scott has been more than happy to come out and speak to the press. And what's more than that is he's come out, and there haven't been these sort of super media trained interviews where he comes out and speaks for an hour but says very, very little. Kieran Scott is someone who's very, very open, very articulate, and very, very open to answering questions from anybody and everybody. The way that he answers these questions about even the most, the most kind of controversial topics from the summer transfer window, a lot of people would shy away from it, but he does come out and hit the nail on the head. He speaks very, very openly and honestly about situations like Latte Lath during the course of this summer. About the process of how they go about signing players, something which a lot of clubs wouldn't do. And a lot of directors of football or heads of football would like to keep their cards close to their chest, really. But Kieran Scott is someone who's very open, and that's something which I think is going down very, very well with Middlesbrough supporters. I think fans really appreciate that openness and communication from the head of football, and it's something which I think is bringing supporters closer to the club. Something that Scott is solely responsible for since he came in a couple of years ago. So if you have listened to the interview, do let me know what you think about it and what you think about Kieran Scott's impact at the club. What have you made of his signings? What have you made of his impact on the wider club during that time? Drop into the comments below. Let me know what you think of Kieran Scott's time at the club, and also hit subscribe as well. There's going to be plenty more Middlesbrough content coming up, and speak to you soon.